Dr. Robin DiAngelo.
Thank you, honey. All right, thank you so much. I wish I started every talk with some stretching and breathing like that. That was really lovely. I want to open with this quote by Ijeoma Oluo, who's local to where I live, Seattle. Brilliant. Don't miss anything she writes. Activist, writer, and educator. Because it frames the focus that we're going to take. This is arguably the most complex, nuanced social dilemma since the beginning of this country, and there are myriad roads into it, all of which are important and needed. I have a very short period of time with you, and so we're going to take one particular road in, and that is looking at dominant culture, right? So often when we have professional development or education on race, we study racial others. And we look at their struggles and their histories and their triumphs, what we need to know when we interact with them. But what's always left off the table is struggles, triumphs, and histories in relation to whom, right? This is a relationship, and we're going to look at one particular end of that. And I want to start with a quote by Audre Lorde. I won't get it exactly right. But the quote is, "The true locus of revolutionary change is not the oppressive situations we seek to escape, but that part of the oppressor which is buried deep within us." I am an angry and proud feminist, and I've been an angry feminist for a really, really long time. I could have told you in great detail all the ways that sexism and misogyny has limited my life, but I could never tell you until I spent a lot of work how I could also collude with someone else's oppression. How racism actually helped me navigate sexism and misogyny. Right? So that's what I'm going to focus on today, and get my clicker. But before we go any further, I want to acknowledge that this talk is taking place on the ancestral territories of indigenous peoples. And I think to proceed with the case that I want to make, which is you cannot understand current conditions without understanding the past and being able to connect them to the present, for they are never separate. Right? And to not acknowledge the ancestral territories we're on would be to be remiss. And I think we can definitely see today that these struggles are not in the past. We see this with the Dakota Access Pipeline, with water rights, with issues of sovereignty. The ancestral territories that Seattle sits on, where I am from, are the Duwamish. And yet again, just last year, the Duwamish were denied federal recognition. Right? Today, they are still struggling for that recognition, and it matters because it means sovereignty, treaty rights, relationship to resources. So I am a guest here. I don't know whose ancestral territories we are on. Does anybody? Can somebody call out? Okay, thank you. And if you live here and you don't know, that's worth noticing, right? Not because you're good or bad, but because it points you in the direction of what you might need to learn. So I'm going to take a moment to position myself. And Cherie kind of did that for me. She stole my thunder a little bit. I'm white, everybody. Check me out. Okay? And part of being white is that's a very odd thing for me to be doing. I was not raised to see myself in racial terms. I understood that somebody had race, but not really me. And I definitely was not raised to see it as relevant to anything you could know about me. So what if I'm white? What does that have to do with anything? Well, I'm clear today that I am white. That I have a white frame of reference, I have a white worldview, and I move through the world with a white experience. And it is not just a universal human experience, it is a most particularly white experience in a society that is deeply separate and unequal by race. So while I'm always coming from that position and perspective. I want to be very explicit about it today, and I'm speaking to the majority of folks in the room, and certainly the majority of folks you work with, because that is who's most often at the table. So when I say we and us, that's who I'm talking to and about. And so let me take a moment to acknowledge what might be valuable for this, about this for people of color, because I recognize we are not all white in this room. Well, the first thing is a great deal of what I'm able to articulate about what it means to be white, to the degree that I can, and I will never be finished, a great deal of that rests on generations of the work of people of color. And whether you're conscious of it or not, the way you hear me today will be shaped by the fact that I'm white. And generally, white people are more open to hearing about whiteness and race and racism from other white people, which invokes another one of Audre Lorde's beautiful quotes, the master's tools dilemma. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Right? So as I stand up in front of you, seeking to challenge whiteness, I am reinforcing it. And I'm clear about that. I have come to terms with it in a couple of ways. If I can be heard more openly, by goodness, I'm going to use that voice and that position, because to not use this position to challenge racism is really to be white. And that's not acceptable. And in an odd kind of way, whiteness remains centered by being unmarked and unnamed. And to decenter it, you have to expose it, lay it bare. And so that's the dilemma. You're centering it while you seek to decenter it. So let me just acknowledge that. As an insider, I do have some understanding of what it means to be white that people of color just can't have. And so if you've ever scratched your head wondering, how do white people pull this off? Do they really not see this? I'll help you with that. And to the degree that that helps you deal with us, because you must deal with us, then that may be useful for you. But people of color will have an understanding of whiteness that I will never have, because from a very early age you have to know my reality as well as your own, in a way that I'm sorry to say I don't actually have to know the reality of people of color. I can be seen as qualified to lead a major or minor organization or institution in this country with no understanding of the reality or experience of people of color. Can I not? Okay. So another thing that might be valuable for folks of color today is that I'm going to name and admit to things white people will rarely ever name and admit to. That might be useful. And nothing in mainstream culture gives any of us the information we need to have the complex, nuanced understanding of this dynamic. What dominant culture does is deny it. And so this may just be a useful framework to hang your experiences on. Okay? For the white folks in the room, I'm going to offer you a couple challenges. First of all, I don't see anyone in this room as the choir. I'm not the choir, you're not the choir. And what I mean by that is, it presumes that our work is finished, that we get it, that we've arrived, and I will never arrive. Right? So the challenge I offer the white folks in the room is humility. Right? No matter where you are. If you have not devoted years of sustained study, struggle, and focus on this topic, and you are white, your perspectives and opinions, and you all have them. I've never met a white person who didn't have an opinion on racism. Have you? If you're not sure all white people have an opinion on racism, just bring racism up next time you're around a bunch of white people and see how that goes. Y'all have opinions, and I don't know anybody. I don't know your struggles, your families, your travels, your studies. And yet I'm confident to say, if you haven't devoted years of sustained study, struggle, and focus, your opinions are necessarily very limited and superficial. Wow, how can I say that when I don't know you? because nothing gives you the information you would need to have more than that. I've developed opinions on many, many, many things. I think I have an opinion probably on everything, but they're not informed. Okay? You can get through graduate school in this country without discussing racism, can you not? You can get through law school in this country without discussing racism, can you not? You can get through social work. You can get through teacher education in this country without discussing racism. And if you're in a progressive teacher education program, you'll have one required diversity course, usually called Multicultural Education. And that doesn't mean you'll be discussing racism. You might just be talking about how to introduce ethnic authors in February. Okay? So when I say necessarily limited, that's what I mean. And by the way, sustained study, struggle, and focus is not a trip to Costa Rica. Multiracial grandchildren are working with a diverse population. I'm serious. That's not sustained study, struggle, and focus. So our challenge is humility. And the very first thing that usually happens that starts to mess with that, well, if I do a good job, you won't be comfortable for the next hour and a half, if you're white. We're not going to get where we need to go from a place of white comfort. And I'm comfortable racially virtually 24/7. That's not what I'm here to reinforce. But one of the first things that starts to get us out of our comfort zone if we're white is that I'm suggesting, one, that white has meaning, and two, that I could know something about you just because you're white. I'm generalizing. All right, so heads up, I'm not going to grant any white person I interact with today any individuality. That precious ideology of how unique we all are is highly protected outside this room. You'll be fine. Okay? In this room, with me, we're going to grapple with what it means to be a member of this group, because I can literally predict how long you will live based on your race. So that's what we'll be struggling with. Positionality. So just really quickly, by every measure across every institution, there's racial inequality, and I'm pretty sure we're the choir in that. I don't have to prove that. The empirical data comes in daily. And yet, at the same time, what is today's dominant racial narrative? Well, I am a former professor of education, so I used to teach in a large teacher training program. The program was 97% white. It was rare for me to ever have a student of color in any class I taught. And we were 10 miles from Springfield, Massachusetts, which is 56% black and Latinx. And on the first day of class, I'd ask my students, take out a piece of paper and write me an anonymous reflection on a couple key questions. How racially diverse were your schools and neighborhoods growing up? What messages have you received across your life about race? And what are some of the ways in which your race has shaped your life? And what I'm going to show you is representative of the hundreds of these anonymous reflections I've collected over the years from our future teachers in their junior and senior years of university, soon to be certified as highly educated, and set forth to teach in Springfield public schools. My neighborhood growing up was not racially diverse at all. Every family in my neighborhood was also Caucasian. Throughout my time in school, I've continually been taught that skin does not matter. Is that familiar to you? It should be. I mean, this is the post-civil rights dominant narrative. And by the way, any white person in the room right now who is thinking, oh, well, I grew up in a diverse school, therefore, I'm going to offer you one more challenge. Do not exempt yourself from anything that I'm going to talk about today. If you had a variation, then it's on you to figure out how that variation set you up to collude with the overall structure, because it did. No one is exempt from the forces of racism in this country, and for those of us who are white, it's on us to figure out how whatever we see as unique about our story, how that still set us up, because we're swimming in water, and it's shared. Right? All right, I see a really, really big contradiction in this narrative. I'm hoping you see it. If race doesn't matter, why so separate? And from that comes a couple questions for me. First of all, how do we teach that race doesn't matter in segregation? I'm going to make a case. We don't teach that at all. We tell that. We say that. It is not what we teach through the actual practice of our lives, which is vastly more powerful than the words that we say. A couple other things that stand out about this narrative. This is all that student could be bothered to write. That breaks my heart. They're going to go forth and teach in Springfield Public Schools. Okay? Now, I would have written 3 pages. I was that student. I would have sat in the front row, and I would have written 3 pages. But the fundamental point of my 3 pages would have still been this. I absolutely recognize this consciousness. It's the consciousness I was raised with, and I think pretty much you can't miss it. So I'll show you bald examples, but try to see where do I recognize that for myself. And this is the younger generation. These students are younger than my own daughter. You know how the story goes, when all the old people die, there'll be no more racism? Because, it's the old people. I don't see this narrative as any more progressive than the one I was raised with or the one my dad was raised with. This has not changed our outcomes. And so we have to ask ourselves, how does this function? It looks progressive. This is not Archie Bunker's narrative. And yet, our outcomes have not significantly changed. So we have to ask, what meaning is this resting on? And how is it actually functioning? Right? Yeah, so I'll just be really direct about this. Sometimes people think, don't you think young people today are? No, I don't. All right. So really quickly, prejudice is prejudgment, thoughts, feelings, attitudes, kind of what's in your head, both conscious and unconscious. And as we're talking about it today, about social others, however social otherness is defined in your particular culture. All humans have prejudice. It isn't humanly possible not to. We get it across our lifespan from multiple sources. And when we act on it, we're discriminating. And most of discrimination is not conscious. And I'm hoping you all know about implicit bias, and if you don't, look into it. I think about it as an iceberg, and at the top of my consciousness is what I'm aware of, and at the top is that everybody's equal and discrimination's wrong. But then there's this massive depth underneath of messages I've received and continue to receive my entire life, which says, no, everybody's not equal, and some discrimination is justified. And that is driving my behavior much more powerfully than this. Okay? So everybody has it, everybody does it. So we can remove the word reverse from this. Right? It's just a human dynamic. However, when we get to oppression, we're at a different level because now we've backed a group's collective bias with legal authority and institutional control, which transforms it. It is now the default of the society and not dependent on anybody's self-image, intentions, or how friendly they are. Right? Gets embedded in every institution and most powerfully in cultural definitions of what's normal, who's normal, who displays appropriate emotions about what, in what context, right? Who's beautiful, who's valuable, who has good hair, right? So I actually want to take an example from one form of oppression, sexism, to launch us into the one we're going to focus on, which is racism. Everybody breathe. I'm going to be using cisgender terms, and I'm aware of that, and I'm doing this deliberately right now because I want to talk about this the way we're taught in school. Okay? So, women in the United States received the right to vote in 1920. There was no other way that we could receive the right to vote except for men to give it to us. One-on-one, a woman, of course, could be prejudiced and discriminate against a man, but women as a group could not literally deny men their civil rights, and men could and did deny women their civil rights. Right? And so it's really critical that when we're using language, we're using it correctly, right? So when I use ism words, I'm including the weight of institutional power behind the act or dynamic. So let me just repeat that. Of course, women could be prejudiced and discriminate against men. Women as a group could not deny men their civil rights. Okay? So today, if men as a group wanted to deny us the right to vote, could they? That was a little harder to answer about a year ago, but notice, right? I mean, this is a huge room, and I'm up on a stage on a mic. But just I can share with you that I always ask that question, and I get kind of a mixed, a little bit confused. Some yeses, some nos, which is part of how oppression works, right? Is that it's so normalized and taken for granted that it can be difficult to see. So let me just show you some basic stats from 2017. Fortune 500 CEOs, 98% male. Top 10 richest Americans are all men. I think economic power is the ultimate form. The Congress is 81% male. Republican side is 90%, and that's significant since they control Congress. Presidency, vice presidency, always 100%. The current cabinet, 91%. The U.S. mayors, 82%. The U.S. governors, 92%. I could go on. Let me just ask you all again. If they wanted to, could they? Yeah. All right. A little more clarity. 10 seconds of the simplest data that's in front of us every day. So it's meant to make 2 points. One, how normalized and taken for granted it is. And of course, if you acknowledge this fact, you're bashing men. I'm sure you've all been exposed to that ideology. But also, by definition, systems of oppression are deeply embedded across history. They're not fluid. Patriarchy did not end in 1920. I do not think patriarchy would have ended if Clinton had become president. We live in androcentric, male-dominated, patriarchal society and always have, right? And just in case you need an image, and of course I know who I'm talking to, so you probably don't need an image, but what the heck. Probably the most powerful committee in our country. I'm pretty sure right now they're discussing the health care bill, and they're right at the part on women's reproductive health. And in case you need an image from popular culture, this is the cover of Vanity Fair 2015. Right? We live in androcentrism. I made this slide. I don't know who that is. I just Googled white guy. But I wanted to make a point which I just found kind of astounding. Of the 100 top grossing films of all time across the world, 99 were directed by men. If you are around children, you know the power of film, right? And I can tell you that they also are 95 of those 99 are white, and they tend to be upper class. They are the least likely to have a wide variety of authentic, sustained, cross-racial relationships, and yet they tell all of our stories. And they shape how we see ourselves, one another, and ourselves in relation to them, right? They get to represent the other, even while they are not in relationship with the other, right? So by definition, oppression or institutionalized systemic power is the ability to disseminate your worldview to everyone, right? And this is why I don't use my terms interchangeably, right? Because when you do, you take this off the table. Right, Facebook puts these things out, and maybe you've seen it. Happy holidays, happy this, happy that. And this one came out on August 26th to commemorate women's suffrage. And then some folks did this. Which women got access to the vote in 1920? So one of the ways that oppression works is that the dominant group's experience is held up as universal. So while we were oppressed as women, we were privileged as white. And actually, all women didn't get access to the vote until the 60s. Right? Okay, and that understanding is intersectionality, right? That you can and do occupy multiple positions, and they intersect in complex ways that must be grappled with. So racism is a form of oppression. It's a system. Racism is a system, not an event. It works on multiple levels to consistently reproduce an unequal distribution of resources between white people overall and people of color overall, with white people the beneficiaries of that distribution. And while all groups who are not perceived and defined as white in this country experience racism, and I believe that to be literate as a white person, I have to understand how different groups experience racism and how I've been socialized in relation and to see different groups. I do believe there is something profoundly anti-black in this culture. Nothing seems to turn white people's cranks like thinking black people got something over on us that they fundamentally don't deserve. And you don't have to scratch very hard for it to erupt. I believe in the white mind, the ultimate racial other is black. And so I want to take one glance at the trajectory of our history towards black people in this country. We can literally think about it as state-sanctioned organized crime that begins with 246 years of enslavement, torture, kidnapping, rape, and brutality, and continues on. About a third of the way through, you see bans on testifying against whites. That made it functionally legal to murder black people, and we are now in my lifetime. And we can move on and we can pick it up at employment discrimination, and we're now in 2017. All what I'm going to read to you empirically supported in the data. Employment discrimination, educational discrimination, bias laws and policing practices, white flight, cultural erasures and attacks, subprime mortgages, mass incarceration, school-to-prison pipeline, disproportionate special ed referrals and punishments, racist media representations, untold history, and so much more. African Americans are not and have never been in the position to do this to white people. White people have always been and continue to be in the position to do this to African Americans. And so we can remove the word reverse from this discussion also. There's no such thing as reverse racism. Thank you. Well, and notice, this is a system, this is not dependent on your intentions, your friendliness, whether you go to lunch with a coworker now and then. This is the water we're in. And if you are not intentionally challenging it, you're playing your part. It's the default. Well, in spite of that, what are we taught racism is? Well, post-civil rights, it made a brilliant adaptation. Post-civil rights, to be a good, moral person and be complicit with racism became mutually exclusive. You couldn't be a good moral person and be complicit with racism. Racists were bad. We saw them on TV. They had fire hoses and dogs and they were beating people. Those are racist. If we were against it, we weren't racist. I think this adaptation, this reduction of racism to this simple formula of mean, intentional people who harm people across race. It is the root of virtually all white defensiveness on this topic. Have you all noticed any white defensiveness on this topic? Just curious. This has functioned to make it virtually impossible to talk to white people about the inevitable absorption of a racist worldview. I'm going to personalize this. As a result of being born and raised in this culture in which racism is completely and thoroughly embedded and infused, as a result of that, I have a racist worldview. I have deep racist bias. I have developed racist patterns, and I am invested in this, one, not seeing any of this, and two, in keeping it active because it has benefited me. I could not avoid any of that. I didn't want it. I don't want it. I've committed my life to challenging it, and it will be the rest of my life to challenge it, because every moment that I push against it, it's coming right back at me. And this simplistic formula makes it virtually impossible to get white people to engage with that examination. And in that, it functions beautifully to protect racism. Okay. So I suggest something you've said or done is racially problematic. You now believe you need to defend your moral character. Ever seen that? And right? So how are you going to defend your moral character? By every way of saying, no, it wasn't racism. It couldn't be racism because I'm not racist. Therefore, you misunderstood me. You see it everywhere. You're too sensitive. You need to lighten up. If you knew me, I've been to Costa Rica. All right. So we know how to fill this in, right? Bigoted, prejudice, old, Southern, drive pickup trucks. We'll get some classism in there. Where do they live around here? Oh, they live in Coeur d'Alene. Yeah, all right. And not racist. Are good, educated, progressive, open-minded, well-intended, young, northern. They live in Boise. They shop at Whole Foods. No. Don't shop at Whole Foods. That's a corporation. They shop at the co-op. And even though they live in Boise, they're moving to Portland. I know my people, right? All right. I like poking a little fun at white progressives. Okay, you need to know this. Why? Because I am a huge white progressive. And when I started this work, I signed up for a job as a diversity trainer, and I thought, well, of course I'm qualified. I'm a vegetarian. I mean, I'm not racist. I'm a vegetarian. How could I be racist? You know, it's all about being open. All right. And I actually think white progressives are the hardest. And I think we land the most harshly on people of color. Because a degree to which we think we're good to go for all the reasons, and we're going to give you that we're good to go, all our energy is going to be going to establishing that, and none of it is going to go to where it needs to go for the rest of our lives, which is deep, ongoing reflection, education, and intentional strategic action. So we need to get rid of this. It's not an either or, good, bad. Actually, we'll do this in the next session. I just want to show you this. I want you to think for a minute about the neighborhoods you grew up in. The vast majority of white people grow up in primarily white neighborhoods and have had almost virtually all white teachers. A friend of mine puts it like that. Pretty much all of us have been taught by white people who've 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 been taught by white people, using textbooks written for, by, and about white people. You see the weight of that? That's under the surface, not what's here. So this is last year's College Jeopardy Champion Playoffs. Those are our best and our brightest. And that's the board at the end of the round. So as we can see, there was a category that was so hard nobody was going to pick it because they didn't want to risk losing. I think it says 1,000 words. Oh yeah, it says African American history. Even the idea that that's not U.S. history. That you could ever know our history and separate that out. Okay. All right, so all of this, this sets up these common narratives, right? So in doing this work, I talk to white people every day about racism, and as I listen to their responses, and of course I made these responses too at one point, I got this image of a dock or a pier, and what it signifies for me is how surface or superficial these narratives are. But also that dock looks like it's just floating on the water, right? But it's not. There's an entire structure underneath propping that dock up. There are literally pillars embedded in the ocean floor that prop that dock up. And everything I'm doing is trying to get off the surface and get under there and look at what is this resting on. And I think about these narratives as two basic categories, colorblind and color celebrate. So probably the number one colorblind narrative is, I was taught to treat everyone the same. Anybody ever hear that one? All right, you ready? Not one person in this room was taught to treat everyone the same. You cannot be taught to do that. You were not taught to do that. You could be told to do it. You can be lectured. I'm going to lecture you right now. You know it's not nice to judge, right? Stop judging. We good? They don't need to fill out evaluations. You see my point? You can't. You don't treat everyone the same. And you don't want to, because people have different needs. When I hear this from a white person, trust me, I hear it every day. Have you all heard that one? The bubble over my head is, oh, this person doesn't understand basic socialization. This person doesn't understand culture. They're not particularly self-aware. And I got to give a heads up. Folks of color, check me if I'm wrong here. But I got to give a heads up to the white folks in the room. When people of color hear us say this, they're not thinking, all right, I am talking to a woke white person right now. Au contraire, okay? It's not doing what we think it's doing. And I don't know why that went off, so you just have to look somewhere else. You know, it's in the past, doesn't really have any meaning. Everyone struggles. My parents weren't racist, that's why I'm not racist. My parents were racist, that's why I'm not racist. Doesn't matter what comes first, I am not racist. So-and-so just happened to be black, but it has nothing to do with why no one in the office gets along with her. And this is another one I'd ask you to consider removing from your vocabulary, along with reverse. Anything that starts with just happen to be, regardless of, well, yes, but at the human level. Because what you're doing in that move is taking race off the table, positioning some kind of universal shared experience, which is really your experience. And there is not one. I might not know what race has to do with my response to my coworker, but I need to be willing to grapple with the reality that race shapes my response to my coworker. All the empirical evidence shows that. So you can see why these are all colorblind. I don't see it, and if I see it, it doesn't mean anything. And there's a question that's never failed me in this work, and it isn't, is it true or is it false, is it right, is it wrong? If we apply those questions to this, we're not going to agree. That's not relevant. The question that doesn't fail me is, how does this function in the conversation? And when we apply that question, we can see that this functions to exempt the person from any further engagement, take race off the table, nothing to see here, let's move on. In doing that, it closes rather than opens the discussion. And in doing that, it protects the current racial order and the white position within it. Well, I'm assuming most of us are beyond colorblind in this room, right? We know that that was not realistic. And so what do the white progressives say? I'm going to get us. We say stuff like this. Oh, I work in a very diverse environment. I have people of color in my family. Me, I'm not racist. I used to live in New York. That one gets used interchangeably with, I'm not racist, I'm from Canada. Tell me you never heard that. I'm not racist, I'm from Hawaii. You know, it's the white people that are picked on there. I'm not racist, I was in the military. Because there's no racism there. So folks of color, get to New York and enlist. Apparently, everything's going to be okay. So sociologists actually have a term for this one. It's called the inoculation argument. I want you to notice, because remember, I'm trying to get us to see what definition is this resting on. And it's called the inoculation because it presumes that the mere proximity to people of color strip us of racism. Notice how often white people feel pulled to tell you how close they are to people of color. because we think that apparently a racist couldn't be close to people of color. And we must, So how many of you, in a conversation with a white person, have heard some version of those? Or if you, let's be honest, or we've said some version of these. So let's do a little discourse analysis. A white person who invokes some version of these narratives is giving you their evidence, right? Racism comes up, I say something like this, I'm giving you my evidence. In my mind, what is this my evidence of? What do I want to make sure you know? I'm not racist. That's not even a stretch, right? These are the things white people say to show that they're not racist. If that's my evidence, what's my definition of a racist? Apparently, if this distinguishes me from a racist, then a racist can't do these things. So I'm going to ask the people of color in the room a rhetorical question. Could a racist work 3 cubicles down from you? Oh, hell yes. Do you have people in your life, white people, who you love and who occasionally run their racism at you? And I can think of at least one racist that lives in New York, but okay. Yes, even an avowed card-carrying racist can do all these things. You guys know that, don't you? Those guys with the tiki torches in Charlottesville, half of them went home and did these things. This is the most simplistic, reductive definition of a racist. And because we have not thought deeply about, well, what am I saying, right? What do I think a racist is? And then how is it functioning in the conversation, right? Children are so much open when the research shows that by age 3 to 4, all children who are born and raised here understand it's better to be white. Right? I marched in the 60s. Anybody ever heard that one? Let me just say, God, I wished I'd marched in the 60s. I would be certified as free of racism for the rest of my life. I already know all this, I took that class. Well, we don't like how white our neighborhood is, but we had to move here for the schools. All right, these are not colorblind. These are, I love diversity. Okay, in the right amounts, but I love diversity. But if we apply the same question, how do these function in the conversation, we get the same answer. They exempt the person from any further exploration or part of the problem. They take racism off the table. In doing that, they close rather than open. And in doing that, they protect the current racial hierarchy and the white position in it. These are not, in fact, any more progressive than colorblind. So we have to go under there and say, what system of meaning am I coming from and how is it operating? Right? So sociologist Joe Fagan has the concept of the white racial frame, and I just think about that as the academic articulation of those pillars. I like a picture because it's vast, but and that's what I'm trying to make visible. Right? The deeply internalized framework through which whites make racial meaning includes images, interpretations, narratives that position whites as superior and that are passed down and reinforced. So let's just take a few looks at that. This is an ad I found on a Delta in-flight magazine. And boy, the first thing that struck me was, look at the racial order in that ad. White women in the front, looking outward, red hair, green. Asian women literally in the middle wearing yellow. Black women in the back wearing brown. So that's what struck me, but when I looked at it more closely, this is an ad for a purse. Take a look at the black women's hands. What do you notice? They're empty. Again, it's so fast, but when you only look at ads for a second, but constantly position, status, hierarchy. Here's another example of the white racial frame. I was looking at CNN and this popped up. Most beautiful women from around the world. look, everything about that's messed up, but we're looking at it racially right now. So, representing South Africa. And there was not one Asian woman in this spread. Asian women are the majority of all women on our planet. So I want to move now into what it means to be white. That's my book. And really what I'm about to say, every other white person in this room can say, and no person of color in this room can say. And this is important, not because we're good or bad, but because left unexamined, we bring it to the table. And we continue to reproduce the same hierarchies. Right? So first I was born into a culture in which I belong. Don't ever underestimate the power of belonging. And if you don't belong in some other axes of your identity, you know what it is to not belong. But to belong racially it's kind of a non-thing. And yet it profoundly shapes everything about your daily experience. So I belong at that administration meeting, the church service, block party, dealing with my daughter's teachers, her camp counselors, belong at that wedding. How many of you have been to a wedding that if it wasn't all white, it was pretty close? Okay, and if you look around, almost everyone's got their hand up, right? I think it illustrates how separate we live our lives, right? Your wedding, big or small, is your circle. But also, at that wedding, it's never me carrying the psychic weight of racialization. I might be carrying other burdens, not that one. Right? Well, we looked at gender earlier. It's very difficult to separate out gender from a race when you get to the halls of power. But let's look at race. I did, of course, put that one statistic up there because it's always about power, not numbers. We know what the presidency, vice presidency looks like. House of Representatives, 78% white, Senate 90. I'm going to show you a series of photographs now, and where you see the yellow border, those are the people of color in that group. Halls of Power, 2016. U.S. senators, leaders of the largest U.S. companies, U.S. Supreme Court, U.S. governors, U.S. top military advisors, people who decide which TV shows we see, people who choose what movies get made, people with the most influence over which books we read, people who decide which music gets produced, people who decide what news is covered, owners of men's pro football teams, owners of men's pro baseball teams, owners of men's pro basketball teams, presidents of Ivy League universities, 95 of the top directors of all time. All right, I didn't put this in here to pick on Paul Ryan, but you can just make a big old assumption about how I feel about him. Frickin' hate Paul Ryan. Okay. But I put this in here because when I saw it, I'm like, this is what it means to be white. To be white is to belong, to be included, to have opportunity, advantage, network, to be at the tables where decisions are made that affect the lives of people not at the table. People you are not in relationship with. These are our future politicians. And I want you to think about the schools they went to, the teachers they had, the neighborhoods they most likely grew up in. Again, I'm trying to illustrate that to be white is to have a particular experience, but it is not universal and it is not objective, even though we are granted objectivity and universality. It shapes us. Okay? And now imagine that those are our future social workers. They are our future teachers, our future judges, our future medical researchers. Well, there's Trump's interns. Well, I was raised Catholic, and I don't know if there's a more powerful image than God. And this is what I saw when I looked up. There's God creating man. There's Jesus and Mary. You know, Catholics are taught that Mary is the mother of God. That's quite the title. Mother of God. And look at her. The historical Mary was not white, nor was Jesus. But it's just so powerful to render her white and then position her as the mother of God. And there's Adam and Eve, the first humans. Well, unlike Jesus and Mary, who are historical figures, Adam and Eve are biblical characters. But the first human beings did come from the continent of Africa. And of course, as a child, I didn't look up and go, God is white, as I never have to. This is on a science website right now. What would a scientifically perfect face look like? Constant messages that it's better to be white. I referenced that children, there's great research on this, by 3 to 4 all children know it's better to be white. Of course, when we don't talk to them about that, we leave them unattended to that message. But here's just some examples. Best hair. We have Halle Berry here. Her hair is straightened. I think it's a particular message to black women. This is the world's most beautiful woman. This is 2015. Now, you know, that's ridiculous, and I see it every day, and so does my daughter. So here's 2015's World's Most Beautiful Woman, 2016 World's Most Beautiful Woman, 2017 World's Most Beautiful Woman. And you know, Julia Roberts is so beautiful that in the whole wide world, they had to go back to her 5 times. She is a 5-time winner. Most beautiful woman in the world. Right? Remember, we're talking about the white racial frame now. And I might look at these covers and think, oh, I wish I was younger. Oh, should I lose weight? But the fundamental signifier of ideal beauty is whiteness. And I've always been inside the frame. These are this year's top 5 runners-up for Miss Teen USA. And yes, those are 5 different girls. You have to concentrate. But we got North Carolina, Nevada, Texas. I mean, just take it in, right? And then this is the group they were drawn from. And as usually happens, there's one, maybe a couple to the back, to the side. And because I know my people, I am confident that for all those white girls, that one black girl is their evidence for why they're not racist. Because everybody loved her. Nobody had an issue with her. Now get her alone in a room and debrief her with someone she trusts. I cannot imagine what that experience was. But I want to move these white girls away from were you or weren't you friendly to the black girl, and to what's going on that this keeps getting reproduced. How is it shaping me, and what role am I going to play moving forward to reproduce it rather than interrupt it if I don't understand how it works? Well, I was racially affirmed throughout my childhood, as are all white children, and this is not the past, so just give you one image there. No little girl misses that message. Whew, The Blind Side. Okay, if you love The Blind Side, don't get mad at me right now. And try not to get defensive, but it's an egregiously racist film. And if you didn't notice, that's great in that it helps show what you're missing, okay? The picture right there pretty much sums it up. But this is the racism. In this scene, this little boy is trying to teach Michael Orr how to play football, but according to the film, Michael Orr never actually can comprehend it. He doesn't have the intellectual capacity. So they just appeal to his instincts. Here's a scene from The Blind Side. You know, I've seen this my whole life. This is what I associate with black and brown space. Contrast that with the white savior. Look at that Christian benevolence. Look at that abundance. What a hero Mrs. Toohey is for rescuing the one and only one that deserved to be rescued. Oh. These are shows that many of us grew up. They take place across the generations. So we have Seinfeld in the 80s, Sex and the City in the 90s, Friends in the 2000s, that's Gossip Girl, current show that just ended, 6 season, Girls. So these are all hugely popular television shows about ideal friendship. And every one of these shows takes place in New York City. Over and over, the message is, even amongst diversity, there's no inherent value in an integrated life. That the ideal world is white. So I want to talk a little bit about intersectionality. I grew up in poverty. And I mean that explicitly, straight up. When people say, oh, we were poor, but we didn't know it because we had so much love, I'm always like, are you shitting me? Like, you didn't, Okay, sorry. And now I'm going to move to a little more serious. Hunger hurts. Homelessness is humiliating. I knew I was poor. Right? I experienced homelessness, living in our car, foster care. I was shamed in class. Right? My mother was a single mom that was, she was sick and she literally could not take care of us. I actually once had my hand, the teacher held my hand up in front of the class as an example of poor hygiene and said, go home and tell your mother to wash you. I share that because I was acutely aware of something shameful about me. I felt stupid. I internalized the messages of laziness. And I used to just stare at those little girls in my class that had clean dresses. They had more than one. They were clean. They weren't torn. Those little girls who took lessons and went to camp and had slumber parties. I didn't do any of those things. And I would just stare at them and just want to be like them. And I can also remember being told when I would see food or something I wanted or felt I needed, and I would reach for it and I would be admonished by my mother or my grandmother, don't touch that. You don't know who touched that. Could have been a colored person. That was the language of the time. And the message was really clear to me. If a colored person touched that, it would be dirty. Now, I was dirty. Okay? But in those moments, I wasn't poor or dirty anymore. In those moments, I was white. In those moments, I was realigned with those little girls in my class that my poverty separated me from. We used people of color to project our dirt, if you will. I don't have less racism because I grew up poor. I learned my place in the racial hierarchy from a different class position than a middle-class girl learned hers. But I still learned it. And while in my early years, because we were urban and poor, I was around people of color, upward mobility took me away as I knew it would if I was going to improve my life. It's on us to figure out how our other identities set us up into the overall structure and not to exempt ourselves because we experience oppression in another axis. So let me tell you what it looks like now. Here's an example of how actually my internalized classism colludes in a way that sets me up to perpetrate racism. So I am the only person in my family to go to college, and I didn't go until I was in my 30s. And so now when I'm sitting at those academic tables, I feel like an imposter. Some people can relate to this. Always feel chronically day late and a dollar short. I struggle with some inferiority. Of course, you would see it on me because I'm white, but that's there. And there's a lot of racism in academia. Anybody notice that? And if you want to get ahead in academia, don't be mentioning racism. Okay? So I'm in those rooms and I'm noticing, oh my gosh, there's so much racism going on in the way we're talking about this new hire. So we're down to a white person and a person of color trying to decide who's going to get hired, and all of a sudden the conversation slips into who'd be a better fit. And you know right now who's going to get that job. Okay? Or we're talking about the curriculum. Whatever, I'm noticing and I want to speak up. But I feel intimidated to speak up. Because what if they cite some research I haven't read? What if they're smarter than me? Okay, so I'm sitting there in silence. Well, I'm noticing racism, but I'm sitting in silence because I feel inferior. It's not superiority that's driving me, it's inferiority. But when I step out of myself and ask that question that never fails me, how does it function? Oh, my silence functions to collude with racism. I'm going to get ahead for not saying anything. I'm going to be seen as a team player. I'm going to protect my position. And when I thought about it like that, it's like, that's not acceptable. And you know what? It's a lie that I'm not as smart as those people. I used to think the smart kids went to college. Ha! No, seriously, I'm stunned. It's not the cream of the crop. It's not the smart kids. It's about access and expectations. Right? So it's a lie that I'm not as smart as they are, just because I grew up poor. And so when I push through that lie that I've internalized, I heal it. I break with that lie. And I use my position in that room, my privileged position, to advocate for someone else. For me, to center race is a powerful way to address all my identities, because you cannot talk about any identity without talking about how race shapes it. Right? So I'm going to close this piece by saying that perhaps the most profound way that my life has been shaped by my race is that I could be born into, I could learn, I could play, I could worship, I could study, I could love, I could work, and I could die in segregation. And not one person who's ever loved, taught, or mentored me has ever conveyed to me that I've lost anything. I think that's the most powerful message of all. In fact, this would be called a good life. White people measure the value of our spaces by the absence of people of color. We do it every day. I know exactly what a good school is. I know why it's good. I know what a good neighborhood is. I know why it's good. I know what's happening when it's transitioning up or down. Right? My wedding looked a lot like that. Why would my funeral not look like that? Well, it won't. Because I've worked really, really hard. But just following the trajectory that our loving parents lay out for us, this is where most white people's lives end. Most white people do not have, and are not particularly motivated to develop cross-racial relationships. So the fundamental message is that there's no inherent value in the perspectives or experiences of people of color. And I've internalized that. My psychosocial development was inculcated in the water of white supremacy. That's what this is. This is white supremacy. This is, when I use it, I'm talking about white as ideal, white as superior, and that is the water we're all swimming in. I'm not talking about the Nazis. My psychosocial development was inculcated in that water. And I've internalized it, and it comes out of my pores. And how does it come out of the pores of good, progressive, committed, social justice-oriented white people? It comes out in our defensiveness, our arrogance, our complacency, our apathy, our lack of humility. Okay. So if we go back and we look at those props, this is what I think is holding up what sociologists call new racism, right? Racism post-civil rights. I think the good-bad binary is unbelievably effective. Deep implicit bias. Individualism, you know, we're all so unique, and here's all the... I am confident in a room this large, there are white people that are sitting here thinking this doesn't apply to you and it's not about you. So let me just say it. It's about you. It's you. You. Mm-hmm. It is you. Right? Internalized superiority, which you also cannot help absorb. You don't have to be conscious of it. And anyone who identifies as a woman or as female, you can see all this coming out of the pores of people raised as men or raised as male. We can actually be doing the same thing around another axis. For me, my understanding of sexism and patriarchy has been a fantastically helpful way to figure out my role in racism. Because whenever there's a piece I'm not getting, I just think, okay, imagine that a man is saying to you what you're thinking, oh, got it. Universalism, this kind of sense that, you know, yeah, we're all white in our organization, but, you know, we got this, you know, we're all good people. And then the power of segregation. When white people tell me they're not racist, I mean, there's lots of thoughts I have, but one of them is, how do you know? How do you even know that? Who are you in relationship with, and what do you talk about? Okay. So how about we just do a quick turn and talk, just to let you interact, because it looks like we got a little more time, which is great, and it's morning. At your tables, think about your workplace. Some of you are sitting together with people you work with, and some of you aren't. But just try to, like, what does this look like in our work? Okay, it is in your work, it's everywhere. And these are some of the ways in. What's welcoming and affirming? Actually, I would say silence on racism is very welcoming and affirming for white people. So if you're having trouble with that one, start there. You know, or when we do talk about it, how do we talk about it? When do we talk about it? Who do we think has the knowledge on it, etc. How do white people respond when the topic of racism comes up? What about their own? What happens when you all talk about racism? Yeah. And then someone says, can I talk to you about yours? What happens then? How do white people rationalize their racial disproportionality? And what pillars of meaning do those rationalizations rest on, and how are they functioning? And what accommodations are made in your workplace for white people's feelings? Let me just try this. Folks of color, are there any accommodations made for white people's feelings? Okay, just checking. All right? If you are white, I'm going to ask you, when you're having these discussions, to say we and me and I and us. And don't talk about anybody else's. Don't say people, society, Trump. Try, it's a courageous conversation. Try to own what role you play. Okay, so go ahead, connect. welcome back. Welcome back. I'm all about patterns. As a sociologist, patterns are incredibly rich entry points for how society reproduces itself. And so when things are patterned, that's actually really helpful to kind of see how that works. And so there's just a pattern that sometimes happens during these discussions. One, of course, is that we distance ourselves and talk about other people's racism. So the number one question I get, besides what do I do, is how do I tell so-and-so about their racism? And my response is, well, how would I tell you about yours? Seriously, because that question presumes that it's not going to be you, right? So we tend to, those of us who are white tend to focus outward. But one of the patterns that sometimes comes up in a discussion like this is people don't actually discuss these questions. Or they just do it for a minute and then they're done and then they're off on some other conversation or what are you doing? Or it's really hard for us to keep our attention on racism. So just notice it, because it's one of the ways I think that it works. And so just a few closing remarks, because I think Idaho, your area, those of you that are here, is predominantly white. And so for the people of color in our organizations, a couple dynamics happen. One is to look to them as the holders of racial knowledge. And where, on the one hand, we do need to validate and start taking the leadership of people of color, but also we need to also look at how we've been set up and not position ourselves as racially innocent and put that on people of color, and then put them in the position to teach us. That's very, very problematic, and I'll kind of leave that with you. I don't really have time to kind of break it down. The other thing is to remember that there's actually a history of harm between our institutions and people of color. I tell this to teachers. When, these parents came in and accused me of being racist or assumed I would be racist. It's like there's a history of harm between public schools and children of color. And it's rational that parents of color would be suspicious and worried and scared to send their children into that institution. And no, they're not going to give you the benefit of the doubt. Show that you're different. And so remember that too, in whatever institution or organization that you're in. When people of color express passion and upset or anger, that's rational. I really think as white people we should ask ourselves, why aren't we angry? Why aren't our hearts breaking, right? And so don't put criteria on them about how to express their pain. It's on us as white people to build our capacity to bear witness. Thank you. And again, given that you're in the area of domestic violence and sexual assault, I mean, everything that you might think about those patterns can apply to this dynamic. In the next session that I do, we'll talk about white fragility, so we'll go a little deeper. But I would like to close by actually asking for about 10 to 20 white folks to volunteer just to come up here, and you're just going to read something. When they come up, please don't clap. And when they get done, please don't clap. And that's because what we're going to be reading is where we should be coming from, not where we are coming from. And so we're not going to clap. We're just hear it, feel it, and imagine if what we're going to read were true. Okay, so can I get 10 or 20 white folks to come up here, and you're just going to read something? Just line up. That's probably enough. So you're just going to pass the mic, okay? You're just going to read. So what I want to leave you with is what it could look like under that dock if we had a different framework. We cannot get there from the current paradigm that tells us only mean, intentional people could ever be racist, right? And that it is an event rather than a system. We can't get there from that paradigm. This is what it could look like. So go ahead, read the first one.
Being good or bad is not relevant.
Racism is a multi-layered system infused in everything.
Whites have blind spots on racism. I have blind spots.
Bias is implicit, unconscious. I don't expect to be aware of mine without a lot of ongoing effort.
Racism is complex. I don't have to understand it for it to be valid.
White comfort maintains the racial status quo. Discomfort is necessary and important.
I must not confuse comfort with safety. I am safe in discussions of racism.
The antidote to guilt is action.
The work is never finished.
I bring my group's history with me. History matters.
I must grapple with intersectionality.
Whites are unconsciously invested in racism. I have unconscious investments.
Feedback from people of color indicates trust.
Feedback on white racism is difficult to give. How I receive feedback is not as relevant as the feedback itself.
It takes courage to break with white solidarity. How can I support those that do?
I can't read, I'm sorry. Given the socialization, it is more likely that I am the one who doesn't understand the issue.
Nothing exempts me from the forces of racism.
The question is not if, but how.
You can go ahead and read the last one.
Racism hurts and even kills people of color 24/7. Interrupting it is more important than my feelings, ego, or self-image.
Thank you. Don't clap. Thank you, everybody. And let's just end with that and just imagine if we were really coming from this place. And notice it's just a place of humility and openness and lifelong learning. But I do believe that not only would our interpersonal interactions change, but so would our institutions, because we would see that they did. It's really, really important to me to break through white denial. But I also just have to say, I'm in front of a lot of audiences on a daily basis, but I sincerely thank you for your commitment to justice and for the work you do every day to keep people safe. Thank you.
Thank you so much.